So anyways, that's what Catmandu is really about.
So that song is really about the complex neurological system that broccoli has and how they actually scream when you pick them.
Yeah, that's why broccoli isn't exactly vegan.
But what about cauliflower? Is that,
Oh, hey mates, I was just telling the fellas here about this documentary I watched last night, all about Bob Seger and the Silver Bullet Band.
Why were you watching that? It's Halloween. Shouldn't you watch something spooky?
Well, it was spooky.
How was that spooky?
Well, did you know that Bob Seger and the Silver Bullet Band were actually werewolf hunters?
Werewolf hunters? But there aren't any werewolves.
Exactly. And you can thank Bob Seger for that.
Oh, Silver Bullet Band. Huh.
And you know, it got me thinking.
About what?
Well, about werewolves and how they're very well represented on film, except not too many people remember too many werewolf movies.
Gee, do you really think so?
Yeah, I really think so.
How do you mean?
Well, you know vampires and mummies and Frankenstein's monsters, zombies and gillmen and oversized lobsters. But do you recall the most underrated monster of all? Well,
Hang on. Are you saying werewolves are underrated?
Well, maybe undervalued is a better word, because there are lots and lots of werewolf movies. They're just not very well remembered.
Oh, pshaw. I remember lots of werewolf movies.
Okay, name some.
Well, there's the Wolfman,
Yeah, and?
and there's, Teen Wolf.
Okay.
Does Teen Wolf 2 count?
No.
Oh, gosh, what?
Airbud.
No, Airbud's about a dog that can play basketball.
Well, isn't that what Teen Wolf's about?
No, Teen Wolf's about a werewolf that can play basketball.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah. Well, you know something? I'm a little stumped here.
It seems that lots of people are stumped as well. Now, if only I had a sentient VCR to ask questions about werewolf movies. Oh yeah, I do. Hey, VC Arnold!
VC Arnold activated and standing by.
What can you tell us about werewolf movies?
The werewolf is a very popular monster, giving way to its own subgenre of film. Though the werewolf is well represented in cinema, these movies are quickly forgotten about by the public, given the illusion that the werewolf movie is underrated. In reality, there are many werewolf movies, even though the public tends to forget about them.
Well, do you think you could whip us up an adventure real quick, all about this very subject?
Yeah, hello.
All right, let's check it out.
Captain Adam, wait.
What's wrong, little creep?
Well, since we're talking about werewolves, and now's a good time to tell you.
Tell me what, little creep?
Oh, I don't know if I can.
Oh, come now, little creep. You know you can tell me anything.
Well, okay. Here it goes. Years ago, I went on vacation to this dude ranch.
What, like in City Slickers?
Yes, like in City Slickers.
Actually, in City Slickers, they explain how it's not a dude ranch and an actual working ranch.
Come on now, Paul the Skull. I think the premise is the same.
Just trying to be accurate.
Anyways, please continue, little creep.
Well, one night, I was practicing my lasso skills, which I got pretty good at. Then suddenly...
Yeah?
I was bitten by
A rattlesnake?
Jack Palance.
Jack Palance?
Well, he was in City Slickers.
No, I wasn't bitten by a rattlesnake or Jack Palance. I was bitten by a cowboy.
You were bitten by a cowboy.
Yes, and now I'm a were-cowboy, forced to walk the earth, accursed, a wretched abomination, wrangling broncos against my will.
I don't think that's a real thing, little creep.
What are you saying, man?
There's no such thing as a were-cowboy.
Gasp! Of all the nerve! As if I would lie about such an awful thing. This is me now, Captain Adam.
Look,
what do you think
I'm
I
just
feel?
saying that doesn't sound real.
Am I not real to you? Am I not real? Is this how you treat your friends who have afflictions? Make fun of them, call them a liar? Oh, the nerve!
Hey, I'm sorry. I didn't know it meant so much to you. So when do you turn into a were-cowboy? A full moon?
No, not a full moon. It's once a month at high noon.
Oh, well, I guess I could have guessed that.
I just want this nightmare to be over. Do you know how many bandanas I have now?
Well, sounds pretty rough, I guess. So anyways, about today's adventure.
Say, that reminds me. What time is it?
Well, what do you know? It's about noon.
Oh dear. Well, I gotta get going. I gotta do something real quick. Enjoy the show. Bye.
Okay, well, let's get going with this episode, huh?
Yeehaw!
How do, boys? What do y'all do for fun around here? I'm about as frisky as a fritter in a frying pan. Little creep? Little creep? Shoot, son. That makes about as much sense as a hairnet on a hedgehog. Cowboy creep's the name, and wrangling broncos is my game.
Oh, for shit's sake.
Little creep, what on earth are you up to?
Well, gol darn, son.
What in tarnation is wrong with you? I ain't little creep. That makes about as much sense as a grapefruit on a goat boat. What? A goat boat? That doesn't even make sense.
Sure does. Makes about as much sense as a pumpkin with a pork loin.
Oh. So, part of being a were-cowboy is making a bunch of abstract similes?
Huh? Son, I don't even know what that means. That makes about as much sense as a TP on a taco. Now, where's the saloon? I gotta wet my whistle. I've been driving them dogies 40 miles from Boogerwood to Yuma. Our canteen's dried up a little east of Fart Gulch. Haven't had a drink in damn near a fortnight. I'm about as parched as a pig on a pitchfork. And that old sun ain't getting any colder neither, if you know what I'm saying.
Well, I guess the answer is yes. So, yeah. Anyways, you mateys enjoy this new Halloween adventure. And let's find an answer to the question, what about werewolf movies? So, happy Halloween and enjoy the show. Yo ho ho!
Time for the show, I reckon.
You reckon? Jeez, oh Pete's. Yar!
Yeehaw!
Somebody end it all, please.
Happy Halloween.
The werewolf.
The werewolf, or lycanthrope, a human with the ability to shapeshift into a wolf, either purposely or after being placed under a curse. Either way, they are now a monster, whether they choose to be or not. Well, that's all a bit spooky, isn't it? Yes, the werewolf. Everybody on Earth knows what a werewolf is. It is a bloodthirsty human and wolf hybrid monster, exhibiting the worst traits of both species, doing things that neither man nor wolf normally would. Would a werewolf if a werewolf could werewolf? Yes, as I had mentioned, everyone knows what a werewolf is. We have known for centuries, if not longer. The legend has its origins in lots of old world European folklore, such as ancient Germanic and Scandinavian stories that would eventually just filter out throughout the entire world. But where did all this start? It had to come from somewhere. There had to be just one source that started this whole thing. Well, like pretty much everything, it started in ancient Greece. Yes, it is said to have all started with the story of Lycaon, the king of Arcadia, who one day, whilst having lunch with Zeus, which apparently was just something you did back then, decided to test Zeus's wisdom and wanted to see if Zeus was truly all-knowing. And did he do this by asking Zeus some random trivia questions or perhaps trying to get Zeus to guess his weight? Which is something that you and I would probably do. No, instead, King Lycaon decides to feed Zeus the roasted flesh of his own son to see if Zeus could tell. What the f? And so Zeus finds out about this trickery and decides to turn King Lycaon into a wolf. Oh, I see. You want to feed people your kids? Well, you're a wolf now. And thus begins the lore of the werewolf. The scientific term for werewolf is lycanthrope or lichen, and King Lycaon is where we get this term. But what about werewolf? Where does that word come from? If you look at the spelling, it really should be pronounced werewolf. Because the last time I checked, that's how you spell were. Well, that extra E just sort of got added as time had its way with the translations. Werewolf is a very old English word, were being spelled with only one E and wolf being spelled with a U. Were meaning man and wolf meaning well, wolf. Whatever you want to call it, the werewolf has become an archetype of monster imagery. And such imagery, which has clearly done well in stories, would most certainly do well on film. And well, it certainly has done. And you can't talk about werewolf movies without talking about The Wolfman, which was released in theaters December 12th, 1941, and this would be a movie that would soon become a Universal Pictures classic, and would make the concept of the werewolf very famous, and would make the Wolfman one of the iconic Universal Pictures monsters. Yes, the Wolfman joined the ranks of Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, and the Mummy, and much like these other monstrous characters, the Wolfman is so well known and iconic that you don't even have to watch the movie to know exactly who he is. And that is tremendous marketing.
Monster marketing!
Sorry. The Wolfman movie is often regarded as the granddaddy of all werewolf movies, even though there are numerous films that predate the Wolfman. But we'll get into that a little bit later. Now, the Wolfman quickly became a powerful on-screen character and one of the iconic movie monsters, most especially for Universal Pictures, in which the Wolfman became a powerful cash cow. So powerful, in fact, that the Wolfman would be treated to multiple sequels, but not without the help of his friends. And the Wolfman would never have a sequel all to himself. They all include other monsters. And these sequels would be one of the first examples of not only a cinematic universe, but also cinematic universe crossovers, and would further establish the Wolfman as one of the big three Universal Pictures monsters. So the Monsturios trifectum would always be Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, and the Wolfman. And these three monster BFFs would be featured in all of the Wolfman sequels, with the exception of Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, which was released in 1943, and then there's The House of Frankenstein, which was released in 1944, to be followed up by The House of Dracula, which was released in 1945, followed by Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which was released in 1948. Now, the jury is still out on whether or not Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein is a true sequel. I mean, it kinda is, and if you'll notice, all of these Wolfman sequels are not just sequels to the Wolfman, but also sequels for Dracula and Frankenstein, as they continue the storylines for all three characters, with the exception being Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, as it does not include Dracula. All of these Wolfman movies would find immortality on VHS, and all of them were released as part of the Universal Monsters Classics Collection. And I've talked about this collection a lot in previous adventures, and I'm not going to talk about it again. The Wolfman was released as part of the first wave of this collection in 1991. Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman was released as part of the second wave in 1992, as was House of Frankenstein. And House of Dracula was released as part of the third wave in 1993. And this would be the only time that both House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula would be released on VHS. And so was the case for many of the other monster movies in this collection, because many of them didn't see the light of day since they were first released in theaters. And that is what's great about this collection, is that it brought many of these forgotten about movies back into the public spectrum. I'm not saying I don't like this collection, I'm just saying I'm tired of talking about it. Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein Wolfman were never part of this collection. Neither were any of the Abbott and Costello Meet the Monster movies. I'm not sure why, because those movies were always a hit and they made Universal Pictures a lot of money. I just think it's quite a shame that those movies are not part of that collection, even though they really should be. But nonetheless, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein was released quite a few times on VHS. The first release was in 1988 by MCA Home Video, and then it was released in 1990 by MCA Universal Home Video, and then it was released in the year 2000 by Universal Home Video. The Wolfman on VHS did have a life before the Universal Monsters Classics Collection, most notable being the 1987 distribution when it was released as part of the Gene Shalit's Critics' Choice Collection, which was a VHS collection that was an assortment of movies that Gene Shalit just thought were the bee's knees. The Wolfman would be released again in 1990 by MCA Universal Home Video, this time without the help of Gene Shalit. And the Wolfman on VHS would even have a life after the Universal Monsters Classics Collection, because Universal would once again release a collection of monster movies in 1999. Only this time, it was way smaller and only contained the A-list of monster movies. And the Wolfman, being an A-lister, was part of this collection. Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman would first be released on VHS in 1986 by MCA Home Video, and it would be released again in 1990 by MCA Universal Home Video. So, are any of these worth a lot of money nowadays? Well, in a word, no. All of them, and I mean every single one of them, are very easy to find and go for an average around $3 to $9. So surely the Wolfman is the most famous werewolf of them all. But are there any other werewolves? Are there any other werewolf movies? Well, sure there are, but the problem is we don't really know about them very well. Yes, actually there are a lot of werewolf movies out there other than the Wolfman, and despite the fact that the werewolf is one of the most famous monster archetypes, there doesn't really seem to be a spotlight on these other werewolf movies, nor does the werewolf really seem to get its just due. And even though it's one of the most popular monsters, the concept just seems to be rather undervalued. And even though the Wolfman is very popular, he even seems to be undervalued. I mean, most of the Wolfman sequels don't even have his name in the title. But why though? Why is the werewolf so popular yet so underrated? Why are there so many werewolf movies that nobody talks about or even knows about? Well, today, in this very special Halloween adventure, we're going to explore the world of werewolves on film, and we're going to ask a very important question: what about werewolf movies? So the Wolfman quickly clawed his way into all of our hearts, and everyone became very familiar with the story of Larry Talbot. He's the guy that was the Wolfman. Even if you don't know him by name, you still know his legend, because as I had mentioned earlier, the Wolfman became such a presence in pop culture that you don't even need to see the movie to know exactly what it's about. It's a story you're familiar with without even knowing anything about it. And also, as I had mentioned earlier, the Wolfman is considered the granddaddy of all werewolf movies, and is mistakenly regarded as the first in that genre. And though it may have branded the concept of the werewolf into the flesh of popular culture, it is not the first werewolf movie. That would be
The Werewolf.
a silent short film that was released in 1913, so it predates The Wolfman by a wide margin. The Werewolf was produced by a company called the Bison Film Company, but it was distributed by Universal Pictures. So not only is The Wolfman not the first werewolf movie, it's also not the first Universal werewolf movie. Now, the shitty part is that this movie was destroyed in a fire at Universal Studios in 1924, and the only thing that remains is a few still shots in which you're looking at right now. So if you're wondering if this was ever released on VHS, well, I think you have your answer. Okay, so there's a silent werewolf movie. Big deal. I'm sure it's the only one, right? No, there's actually another silent werewolf movie called
Wolf Blood.
Though it was also called
Wolf Blood.
A Tale of the Forest. And this movie is often mistaken as being the first werewolf movie, but it's not. The Werewolf is. However, the werewolf usually is forgotten about because it is a short film. And plus, it was destroyed. So, let's forget about it. Wolfblood did not share the same fate as the werewolf, and the film still exists, so it's considered the first surviving werewolf movie. It was first released in 1925 and has recently been released on a number of silent film collection DVDs. However, it was never released on VHS, so we're not going to talk about it anymore. So as film moved forth from the silent era into talkies, as did werewolf movies. And we got yet another Universal werewolf movie that predates the Wolfman with
Werewolf of London,
which was released in theaters May 13th, 1935, and technically this, in fact, is what cemented werewolves into popular culture, though it is just simply not as widely remembered as the Wolfman, so the Wolfman takes the taco there. Werewolf of London was a huge hit and had rave reviews and has been described as a charming bit of lycanthropy, which, it's just something you don't hear nowadays. This would be released on VHS only once in 1992 as part of the second wave of the, you guessed it, the Universal Monsters Classics Collection. And as I had mentioned earlier, this collection was neat because it was the first VHS release for many of the movies in it, and this is one of them. And this is not very expensive nowadays, around $5 is your average, but I'll tell you what, it is sort of hard to find. Is that because it's a rare VHS? No, because it will confuse your search engine, and that is because of another werewolf movie, An American Werewolf in London. Here, I'll give you an example. Computer.
Working.
Search the internet for Werewolf of London VHS.
Working. Did you mean An American Werewolf in London?
No, Werewolf of London VHS.
Working. Showing results for An American Werewolf in London?
No, Werewolf of London VHS.
Working. Did you mean An American Werewolf in London?
No, just forget it. So once your computer finally realizes what you're talking about, there are many listings for Werewolf of London.
Did you mean An American Werewolf?
No! Well, since the computer insists on talking about it, let's talk about
An American Werewolf in London.
Did you mean Werewolf of London VHS?
Anyways, An American Werewolf in London was released in theaters August 21st, 1981. And this is considered a horror comedy, though much of the imagery is completely terrifying. Especially the design of the werewolf in this, which is called the Kessler Wolf, and is regarded as one of the best werewolf images ever. Director John Landis, who had proven his comedic chops with such films as The Kentucky Fried Movie and Animal House, proved with An American Werewolf in London that he can also make a pretty damn good horror movie. And this is certainly the second most well-known werewolf movie next to the Wolfman. And Michael Jackson was a huge fan of this movie, so huge in fact that he used it as an inspiration to the music video for his nice little song, Thriller. But not only that, he also got John Landis to direct the video and Rick Baker to do the makeup effects, who was responsible for the makeup effects in An American Werewolf in London. Can you imagine being that famous that you can get a director to direct your music video simply because you liked their movie? I can't, but that does explain why that music video always seemed rather familiar. And speaking of this video, did you notice in the background that there's a poster for Schlock, a 1973 John Landis horror comedy? And when you watch this video, you'll realize how underrated Rick Baker is.
Rick Baker turned me into a werewolf, even though I kind of look like a little kitty cat. Meow.
To be fair, that video never really says he's supposed to be a werewolf, so he could be a were-kitty cat. All were-kitty cats aside, An American Werewolf in London had a very rich life on VHS, as it was released multiple times, the first being in 1981 by MCA Home Video. It would then be released by Vestron Home Video in 1985, and again in 1990 by Video Treasures. It would then be released in 1991, 1994, and 1995 by Live Home Entertainment. And then it was released in 2001 by Universal Home Video, so this movie had a shit ton of VHS releases. So are any of these VHS releases worth a lot of money today? No. Hey, the movie was popular, and if the movie was popular, they're going to make a lot of VHS for it. And if they made a lot of VHS for it, that means it's not rare. Which translates into, you're not going to get shit for this tape. Which sucks if you're trying to sell it, but does not suck if you're trying to buy it. You can get one anywhere from $5 to $10, and it's easy peasy lemon squeezy to find. Especially if you're looking for Werewolf of London VHS.
Working. Did you mean An American Werewolf in Paris?
No, but that's a good point. An American Werewolf in London did have a sequel, An American Werewolf in Paris, which was released in theaters December 25th, 1997. Oh, it's like a Christmas movie. No, it's not. Yeah, this movie sucks. It did terrible at the box office, barely broke even, got terrible reviews. I don't know. Maybe you shouldn't wait so long to make a sequel. Not to mention that pretty much nobody involved with the original movie's production is involved with this movie, so forget this movie. But it was released on VHS. Here it is. Yada, 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 yada. And no, it's not worth anything. Let's move on. So, An American Werewolf in London and The Wolfman have to be the two most well-known werewolf movies. But after that, the public's knowledge of werewolf movies gets a little foggy. And no, I'm not going to talk about Teen Wolf. Basically because I've already talked about it, and that segment is featured in the Week of the Week installment all about movie-based cartoons, which is in the archives if you wanted to check that out, and I highly encourage you to do so. But I guess you'd have to say that tied for number 3 in the most well-known werewolf movies would have to be the two films Wolfman and The Howling. And it would seem that 1981 was a good year for werewolf movies because not only was An American Werewolf in London released, but so were these two movies. Yes, The Howling was released in theaters March 13th, and Wolfman was released July 24th. Okay, so technically, I suppose Wolfman really isn't a werewolf movie because it's about ancient Native American wolf spirits that come to kill people. But the association is close enough, and Wolfman is considered a werewolf movie by proxy. Plus, this does play out as more of a crime drama, but I'm fine with that. I mean, a lot of horror movies use that method of storytelling. It's a good way to advance the story because not only are the characters trying to figure out what's going on, but so is the audience. It's a cinematic journey through crime investigation. Whatever you want to consider this movie, it was first released on VHS in 1981 by Warner Home Video in the classic Warner Home Video clamshell, and also this has probably the most boring cover of any movie. Aside from the clamshell, Warner Home Video was also famous for doing this. They would use a very boring picture from whatever film the VHS release was of instead of the actual poster, which 100% of the time was way more interesting than the photo they used. And especially this one. I mean, geez, you couldn't use a picture of one of the wolves from this movie? I mean, I don't even know what this movie's supposed to be about. I mean, it sort of looks like some kind of coping with divorce pamphlet you would get at a family counseling center. But the weird part is that Warner Home Video would not do this with all of their VHS releases. They would sometimes use the actual poster from the movie, so it makes you wonder why they wouldn't do it for all of their releases. But I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about werewolf movies. And Warner Home Video would release Coping with Divorce, Wolfman, 2 more times. They would release it in 1988 and finally in 1999 as part of their Warner Brothers Hits collection. So are any of these VHS releases worth a lot of money today? Well, again, I'm gonna have to go with no. The 1988 and 1999 releases are remarkably easy to find and pretty cheap, the average being about $5. The 1981 release can be a little tricky to find, like any of the Warner Home Video early releases, and finding one that's in halfway decent shape is a bit of a challenge too. And they tend to average within the mid-tier price range. $15 to $20 is what you got. But chances are the one you find will look like it's been attacked by gibbons. The Howling is a nice little film where there's no question or argument as to what it's about. It's a werewolf movie about werewolves. They're not metaphoric werewolves and or wolf spirits, they're werewolves. This is based on a 1977 novel of the same name by Gary Brandner, and to no surprise to anyone, the film really doesn't have much to do with the book. Yeah, it's a film adaptation, and film adaptations do what film adaptations do. In fact, the 4th movie, Howling 4, the original nightmare, is more faithful to the book than the first movie is, which is sort of weird. And yes, you heard me correctly, I said the 4th movie, which makes The Howling a film franchise. In fact, The Howling is a very underrated 80s horror movie franchise. Sure, stuff like the Friday the 13th film series or the Nightmare on Elm Street film series usually takes the cake when it comes to 80s horror movie franchises. Or at least they get the most recognition. But why not the Howling film series? What is with this unmitigated bias against werewolf movies? Is it because the subgenre of horror film that is the werewolf movies is treated like the unwanted stepchild of the movie world, constantly seeking the approval and praise of its peers but forever being neglected and shunned? Is that why the Howling film series is forgotten about? Or is it because it kind of sucks? Yeah, that would pretty much be the reason. Yes, I'm afraid that the reason the Howling film series has been buried beneath the sands of time is because it's not very good. In fact, pretty much all of these sequels, with the exception of the second movie, were direct-to-video releases. And as I had mentioned in previous adventures, direct-to-video does not always mean bad. But in these cases, it sure does. But regardless, it's still a very expansive film franchise. There's
The Howling 2. Your sister is a werewolf.
What? Your sister is a werewolf. That's the title? Huh. Which would have a limited theatrical release in December of 1985. And now it's time to get dumb with The
Howling 3. The Marsupials.
Okay, what? The Marsupials? What is happening here? Yeah, this 1987 direct-to-video release takes place in Australia, and the werewolves apparently have pouches. And if that's not enough for you, this is the only movie in the Howling series that's rated PG-13. So, there you go. And then there's
The Howling 4, the original nightmare,
which was released direct-to-video in 1988. And as I had mentioned earlier, this is the movie that's most faithful to the original book, even though the first movie should have been, but that's okay, because at least that didn't feature werewolves with kangaroo pouches. And moving on, we have
The Howling 5, The Rebirth,
which was released direct-to-video in 1989. And then we have
The Howling 6, The Freaks,
which was released, yep, you guessed it, direct-to-video in 1991. And then there's
The Howling New Moon Rising.
Wow, geez, you're telling me they had 7 of these movies? So 6 sequels total? Wow. Which was released in 1995, direct to video.
No
way. Get out of town. Now, there's not really much that's interesting to tell about the sequel's VHS releases, but the first movie's VHS release certainly has an interesting yarn to spin. It was first released on VHS in 1982 by 20th Century Fox Home Video, in that distributor's own version of the book box, which MGM Home Video made so famous. But there was a time where 20th Century Fox Home Video used this method of packaging as well. And in the VHS collector world, this is known as the Fox Box. And they are usually very hard to find, and the Howling is no exception. I currently can't find any listings for it, so I can't tell you what it's going for. So if you yourself happen to have this, you could get away with listing it for an outrageous price. I'm not saying you'll get that price, but you could try. It would then be released on VHS in 1983 by Embassy Home Entertainment. Then it was released in 1984 by Nelson Entertainment Home Video, and then it was released in the year 2000 by MGM Home Video as part of their
MGM Movie Time collection.
With the exception of the 1982 distribution, all of these distributions are rather easy to find and go for around $5. And all of these sequels, if you happen to want them, go for very cheap as well, with the exception of the Howling 2, Your Sister is a Werewolf, because for some reason, that's sort of pricey. So now let's throw all segues aside and talk about
Hammer Films.
And if you're not familiar with them, they are a British film company famous for their own more ghastlier renditions of the classic movie monsters. Yes, they are known for their own versions of Dracula and Frankenstein, in which they've made many films of. But unlike those two monster archetypes, Hammer Films seemed as though they were not too interested in werewolves because they only made one werewolf movie, which was
The Curse of the Werewolf,
which was released in theaters June 7th, 1961. And this was not as successful as Hammer's Dracula and Frankenstein films, which is probably why they never bothered to make another werewolf movie. This is based on the 1933 horror novel, The Werewolf of Paris.
Working. Did you mean An American Werewolf in Paris VHS?
No, I didn't. Anyways, this was written by Guy Andore. Or maybe it's just Endor.
Chihuahua.
Unlike most other film adaptations, this one is sort of faithful to the book. However, it's set in a different century, and Guy Andore didn't even get credit for it. Well, how do you like that? Back to Hammer Films for a second, before you start thinking that they were simply rip-off artists by making their own monster movies of the monsters that Universal Pictures had previously made famous. It should be known that Hammer Films actually had a partnership with Universal Pictures, and Universal Pictures would serve to be Hammer Films' international distributor. And if you're wondering why I'm bringing this up, it's about to make a whole lot more sense. Since Universal Pictures was Hammer Films' international distributors, for a time, Universal held the home media distribution rights. Well, for some of the Hammer movies. And that's where it gets a little shaky, and I'm not going to go into a bunch of legal jargon, but Curse of the Werewolf was one of the Hammer films that Universal held the home media rights to. And Universal's home media helm was, at a time, MCA Home Video, then it was MCA Universal Home Video, and then it was just simply Universal Home Video. And The Curse of the Werewolf would be released on VHS in 1987 by MCA Home Video. And then it was released in 1992 by MCA Universal Home Video. Yep, the same year that Universal released the second wave of their Universal Monsters Classics Collection. And oddly enough, it is not part of that collection. For one reason or another, it just did not cut the mustard. Yes, again, it all comes down to legal jargon, because The Curse of the Werewolf technically was and technically wasn't a Universal property. But The Curse of the Werewolf on VHS could easily be your property, because both of these distributions are not rare. They're very easy to find. There's many listings for them, and the prices range from $7 to $35. Now, The Curse of the Werewolf was the only Hammer Films werewolf movie, but they almost made another one. However, they quickly lost interest and sold the rights to the story to Tyburn Pictures, a short-lived British-based production company. But it wasn't just a story, it was a legend. It was Legend of the Werewolf, which was released in April of 1975, but only in UK theaters. It never had an international theatrical release. It was a straight-to-video release in the US, and the first distribution was in 1981 by Electric Video Incorporated. And then it was released in 1985 by VCL Communications, which was a subsidiary of Media Home Entertainment. And then it was released in 1987 by Interglobal Home Video. And if none of these distributors sound familiar to you, that should tell you something about the rarity of these tapes. And the rarity should tell you something about the current asking prices. The 1981 Electric Video Incorporated distribution barely has any current listings for it, and those listings are going for around $80. I couldn't even find any current listings for the 1985 VCL Communications distribution, and the 1987 Interglobal Home Video distribution is currently going for around $30. So when it comes to rare werewolf tapes, it would seem that these are where it's at. Where it's at. Get it? Oh boy, never mind. Maybe instead of werewolf tapes, I should call these rare wolf tapes. Just forget it. Anyways, that brings us to the actor Peter Cushing. Now, many of us, depending upon which generation that you're from, were first introduced to him from his work in Star Wars: A New Hope, but then later would discover that he is actually a horror movie icon and has been in like 1 million Hammer films. But not all of them, and oddly enough, he was not in Curse of the Werewolf. That does not mean that he would not eventually do a werewolf movie, it just wouldn't be a Hammer Films werewolf movie, as he would star in Legend of the Werewolf. But he was also in another werewolf movie,
The Beast Must Die,
from 1974. Now, this is not exactly what you could call a traditional werewolf flick. It plays out as more of a mystery movie. It sort of seems like Clue mixed with the Wolfman. However, it's not exactly as interesting as that sounds. In the theatrical cut of the film, it actually includes what was called a werewolf break, a intermission to let you try to figure out who the werewolf was. Though that is an innovative idea to make the cinematic experience more interactive, it just did not work all that well. Because since this took place during the climax of the film, it pretty much took all the wind out of the sails. Yep, it killed the momentum, and you really just should not do that in a movie. But some people did like it. Hey, it's different. And what else is different about this movie is the Agatha Christie type feel it has about it. Yes, it certainly is a different kind of werewolf movie, and that is always welcome. Though the werewolf design in this movie does leave a lot to be desired. I mean, it's a dog. I like dogs, but this is a werewolf movie, not a were-dog movie, and that is clearly a were-dog. What else is weird about this movie is despite all the creepy, spooky promotion it had, this is only rated PG. Certainly not the big bad scary werewolf movie or lycanthropic bloodbath they tried to tell us it was. So it's a PG rated were-dog movie that seems to have been written by Agatha Christie. But it's pretty fun. This movie was eventually recut without the werewolf break and released as Black Werewolf. This was released on VHS by Impulse Productions. I don't know, your guess is as good as mine, in 1989, and is the perfect example of what the epitome is of false advertising. Look at that ridiculous cover. This never ever happens in the film. I don't know where they get this from, but this does not happen. This is a PG movie that looks like you would find it in the back room of the video store, if you know what I'm saying, and I'm sure you do. Black Werewolf is the exact same movie as The Beast Must Die, sans the werewolf break. I just don't even know how they got away with this, but apparently one of the stories is that the rights for The Beast Must Die was sort of up in the air due to some kind of legal loophole. I don't know if that's really true or not, and I'll be damned if I really even care. The VHS for Black Werewolf is pretty rare nowadays because the mega home video distributor that was Impulse Productions yeah, right, did not make a lot of these, and I'm sure you're very shocked about that. The Beast Must Die, however, does have more of a storied history on VHS. It would first be released in 1981 by good old Nostalgia Merchant. Well, that's pretty cut and dry, right? There can't be anything too complicated about the other VHS distributions, right? Wrong! Yeah, this is where it gets a little murky. It was released again in 1986, but by three separate distributors. That means there are three separate VHS of the same movie from the same year. Hey, I told you about that copyright legal loophole, and here is another example. It was released in '86 by Prism Entertainment, Interglobal Home Video, and Starmaker Home Video. And finally, in 1992, it was released by JTC Incorporated. Only one distributor? Boring. All of these distributions are rather easy to find today and go for an average of $9, except for the 1981 Nostalgia Merchant distribution, which I can't find anywhere. So those are some werewolf movies that you may or may not know all that well. But let's continue to wander down our little werewolf waterfall and talk about some werewolf movies that seem to be completely forgotten about. Let's talk about Silver Bullet, which was released in theaters October 11th, 1985, and was immediately swept under the rug. Yeah, it did well at the box office, but for whatever reason, people just sort of forgot about this movie. Is it because of the unmitigated anti-werewolf bias that I spoke of before? Why is this movie seemingly forgotten about when it really should not be? The setup for success was all there. Corey Haim and Gary Busey's in it, not to mention that this is based on a short story by Stephen King. Yeah, this is based on his 1983 illustrated novella, Cycle of the Werewolf. No, not that kind of cycle. And I like this Stephen King story because it's short and it has pictures. And quite honestly, I didn't even know they made a movie about this until just a few years ago. Usually when a movie is based on a Stephen King story, you hear about it all the time. So why wasn't this movie the promotional powerhouse that other movies that are based on Stephen King stories are? I brought up Corey Haim earlier, and you might be wondering what the hell does that mean? Let's not forget that in the 80s, Corey Haim was a pretty big deal. Yeah, he was one of those child star teeny boppers that they pushed the hell out of, and if he was in a movie, you knew about it. Now, it's true that Silver Bullet was released pretty much before that tidal wave of teenage girl infatuation crashed forth upon the neon shores of 80s popular culture. But still, just based on the 80s icon that Corey Haim became, you would think that eventually and retroactively this movie would have more hype than it did. I just find it rather strange that this movie is not better remembered than it is. Though the public may have forgotten about this movie, VHS did not. It was first released on VHS in 1986 by Paramount Home Video. They would release it again in 1988, again in 1993, and finally in 2001. Though the 1986 and 2001 distributions do seem to be a little tricky to find, you can find the other two rather easily for an average of $7. So let's move on to
I Was a Teenage Werewolf,
which was released in theaters July 19th, 1957. Okay, so maybe this isn't exactly a forgotten about werewolf movie because everyone's heard of this movie, and you don't even have to see this movie to know the ridicule it invokes. Yes, this movie is regarded as a big joke, but even though it seems to exist just to be made fun of, and trust me, there's a lot to work with here. When this came out, this was pretty serious. It was a huge hit in theaters. It was made on a budget of $82,000 and took in $2 million at the box office. Not bad for a movie you couldn't force yourself to take seriously today. And this movie had the tagline, the most amazing motion picture of our time. Plus, this movie stars one of the greatest horror movie icons, Michael Landon? Yeah, long before he was in Little House on the Prairie and Highway to Heaven, Michael Landon was a werewolf. But not just any werewolf. A teenage werewolf! Despite how big of a quote-unquote cult classic this movie became, it only had one VHS release. And that's fine, because that's really all you need. This would be released on VHS in 1991 by RCA Columbia Home Video. This movie may not be exactly forgotten about, but the VHS collection its VHS was a part of sure is. In 1991, RCA Columbia Home Video released a very short-lived collection of B-movies. And given the year of this release, this is in no doubt an answer back to the, yep, you guessed it, the Universal Monsters Classics Collection. And RCA Columbia Home Video said, hey, we can do that too, and released their Drive-In Classics Collection. And nobody cared. And this was completely and instantly forgotten about. But hey, they tried, and this wasn't necessarily a bad idea. And much like the Universal Monsters collection, this collection features movies that weren't previously released on VHS. The I Was a Teenage Werewolf VHS isn't exactly rare, but the prices can get sort of mid-tierish. And finding the entirety of the collection up for sale is a bit tricky because chances are not too many people bought all of these. I don't know, I think it would be neat to have, just because you don't see this every day, and I didn't even know this existed. And speaking of things we didn't even know existed, let's get back to some forgotten werewolf movies with
Fury of the Wolfman.
From 1972, and this is a Spanish film, so the title is really La Furia del Hombre Lobo! And before you start thinking that Fury of the Wolfman is an awesome movie because it has an awesome title, I want you to go ahead and think the exact opposite. This movie is insanely awful. Terrible overdubs, mistranslations, it's all over the place. And the plot seems like it was written by someone who names their crayons before eating them. Let me lay this on you. It's about a guy who gets bitten by a Yeti that turns him into a werewolf. I mean, if anything, shouldn't that turn you into a were-Yeti? Or maybe it wouldn't do anything except hurt. Yes, this is total lunacy, and what's even better is this is the fourth movie in a 12-film series. The most notable of this film series would be
Mark of the Werewolf.
Well, it's a Spanish movie, so it's really
La Marca del Hombre Lobo.
From 1968, and one of the things that's most notable about this movie is that it was released in 3D. Oh boy, you can see the shit come off the script and fly at you from the screen. Another notable aspect about Mark of the Werewolf is that it had like a bazillion other titles. Yeah, it played the we can't find a distributor, so let's give it a punchier title and see if that'll help game. The most famous renaming of this movie was
Frankenstein's Bloody Terror.
And it was called that for absolutely no reason. And even Fury of the Wolfman had an alternate title besides La Furia del Hombre Lobo. It was also called
Wolfman Never Sleeps.
But Fury of the Wolfman is what stuck, and you might be surprised to know that this actually made it to VHS. And even if you're not surprised, I sure as hell am. And what's even more surprising is that this had numerous distributions, including a 1987 Charter Entertainment release, which I'm sure they're very proud of. This would also be released by Unicorn Video. Okay. But I'm not sure when, because there's no date on the tape, so the year is unclear. It was also released in 1991 by Alpha Video Distributors with cover art that looks like it was drawn by me. Alpha Video would release it again in 1995 with way better cover art, and we're all very glad you actually tried this time. Are these tapes rare today? Well, kinda, but not really. The Unicorn Video distribution is impossible to find, but you know what? That's okay. There's plenty of listings for the other distributions, but they go for some pretty high prices. Yeah, that way you can stink up your VHS collection and pay a lot for it. You know, I really shouldn't say that though, and perhaps I shouldn't be so hard on these movies because they star Paul Naschy, the so-called Spanish Lon Chaney. He has a huge cult following and is renowned as the master of Spanish horror movies because he's been in like a bazillion Spanish horror movies, portraying not only the Wolfman like he does in these films, but Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, the Mummy, Hunchback of Notre Dame, just to name a few. So no matter how bad these movies may be, they are not without merit. Moving on, we have The Company of Wolves from 1984, and is not only a forgotten about werewolf movie, but also a totally underrated film. Now, whether you consider this a werewolf movie or a take on Little Red Riding Hood, you're correct. This movie is a very non-conventional version of both descriptions. This movie is known for having some of the most disturbing and grotesque werewolf transformation scenes ever. I mean, look, that face is pooping a wolf. And it also has just some plain old bizarre imagery. Look at that. Before this movie suffered the same fate as a lot of other werewolf movies and got submerged beneath the silty sinew of the cinematic sludgescape and was long forgotten about. It was released on VHS in 1985 by Vestron Home Video. And it's sort of easy to find today. There's not too many listings for it, leastways ones that are in decent shape, and they do tend to go for some pretty mid-tier prices, but still, it would be a unique addition to your VHS collection. Man, I tell you, there really is a ton of werewolf movies out there, and really, we've only gotten halfway through the 9-layer werewolf dip that we've been splurging into today. And the werewolf would not only stalk cinema on the big screen, but on the small screen as well. And the werewolf would be brought to television with Werewolf. No, not Airwolf. Werewolf, which aired on Fox from July 11th, 1987 to August 21st, 1988. And like most lycanthropic media, it was immediately forgotten. And it was never released on VHS in the US. And that brings us to the end of our little lycanthropic adventure. And yes, I know, there are some things that I left out. For time reasons, I just can't cover them. I mean, did you really expect me to cover every single piece of werewolf media out there? Because there is a lot of it out there, which makes things even more odd. The werewolf is a popular concept, yet always forgotten about. The concept is not underused, it's just undervalued. The werewolf is a popular monster, and there have been tons of werewolf movies made, only for the cinema world to glance them over, with always the emphasis on vampires or zombies. What's with all the zombies? I am so sick of zombie movies. Maybe you yourself have not forgotten about the werewolf movie, and maybe you yourself know and love all the films I've talked about today. But even though it's one of the staples of monster imagery, the world has seemingly turned its back on the werewolf. However, the werewolf story isn't going anywhere, and ever since King Lycanon fed Zeus his kid, there will always be Lycan lurking in the long history of the world. So I hope you enjoyed this Halloween adventure. Be sure to hit subscribe and share this shit, and have a spooktacular Halloween. And I'll see you next time, only on Captain Adam's VHS Pirate Ship. Happy Halloween, mateys!